problems that we need to fix, which is quite exciting. In Europe in particular, there's a shift that we're only really beginning to understand, which is this kind of the end of a very comfortable kind of Cold War and post-Cold War social contract between business and government and people. And many of our assumptions about how that world works are breaking down. If you look underneath the kind of surface of this, there's actually a very long-term issue in terms of productivity and also return on kind of invested capital. So there's a really interesting guy called John Hagel who works at Deloitte's Center for the Edge, and he looks at this graph and shows essentially a declining return on investment and fixed assets in the US economy that goes all the way back really to, the decline begins in the late 60s and the early 70s. And there's another economist, a guy called Tyler Cowen, who wrote a book called The Great Stagnation, a very short book earlier this year. It's a very, very interesting book, and he says, basically, in the early 20th century, we picked the low-hanging fruit of economic development. So we converted, unproductive land into farmland. We took people who were, not well educated. We educated them and put them into industrial era jobs, etc. And all of these mechanisms achieve kind of strong returns on investment. But actually, as we've gone forward, there are less and less of these opportunities to achieve those kind of returns. And so what we're seeing is kind of an underlying, almost flatlining of the mainstream economy in terms of investment in people, investment in plant, investment in fixed assets, and so on. And it's a really interesting debate. Tyler Cowen, by the way, the reason I show this picture, this is actually a picture from his blog, and it's a proper patent that was indeed filed. And I think his point is, when you get to this stage of seeking marginal improvement on previous products and innovations, then you have a real problem. You're running out of good ideas, basically. There's another economist in the UK, Will Hutton. Will Hutton wrote a response to Tyler Cowen's thesis, where he basically argues, yes, this is correct, we are in danger of facing 10 years of almost no growth and not enough growth to meet increasing entrance into the labour market, increasing expectations of people in society, etc. But he said the answer, in his view, is innovation, and not just technology, and not just what we think of as conventional computer-based technology, but things like clean tech, things like green technology, and a whole range of other things. But he said fundamentally, without that innovation as an engine for growth, we will in fact face Tyler Cowen's 10 years of nothingness, and we'll end up looking like the kind of Japanese economy did for the last 10 or 20 years. We have an organisation in the UK, Nesta. Was at one time a kind of government-funded national endowment for science, technology, and the arts. Now it's a charity. They put together a really compelling report that's really about the UK context of growth at the moment, that says, we don't want Plan A, which is kind of austerity. We don't want Plan B, which is a basic kind of Keynesian pump priming. What we need is Plan I. We need to really focus on where innovation can work and where innovation can make a difference. And they say, if you look at the economic growth in recent years, 63% of that growth in the UK context has come from innovation, as opposed to just better returns on existing inputs. But we're in something of an innovation strike as a result of the recession. So he says, if you look at the figures from 2009 to 2011, there's really a 14% drop in innovation investment in the UK. And so they regard that as an extremely worrying condition, and one that could have a real impact on the next 10 years or so. Another piece of context is that, from my own point of view, we have a real need to kind of blur the boundaries between economic actors. So we used to live in a world where business was kind of amoral, or regarded as amoral. Its only goal is growth and profit. And over here, these nice charities and social enterprises are wonderful and fluffy and warm, but actually they don't need to think about sustainability, and they don't need to think beyond their next grant funding round. And then over here, we have humans who are believed to be rational actors in the economic sense. In other words, driven by extrinsic rewards, driven by pay, driven by rules, etc. And I think none of those three kind of archetypes is necessarily true anymore. And I think if we are to look to solve some of the employment-related issues, some of the innovation-related issues, we need to think way beyond just business versus charity, corporate versus startup. And we need to think about some really new blended models. For example, where people can enter into connected lifestyle businesses who have no hope of growth or selling or achieving investment, but sustain themselves and their families and help regenerate areas where people have lost jobs very quickly. And also, I think, as I'll come on to in a few minutes, if you look at this in the context of wider economic development, in particular global economic development and things like aid programs and international development, I think there's, we're way behind in terms of looking at organizational models and in particular the role of networks in those operations. And so I think that's something we need to do a better job of thinking about. Some other challenges that we face. I think we have a range of social challenges in Europe for sure, but also in other areas of the world as well. So, the challenges of an aging population, the impact that places on healthcare, for example, and social care, and also the role of welfare. So, obviously, in Scandinavia, there's been a very successful experiment with state-led kind of high welfare, high taxation societies. There's no question that that's delivered prosperity and stability. In the UK, there was a consensus around the welfare state and the level of spending on the welfare state. There is not such a consensus anymore, and we're having very interesting debates about whether all of that spending was in fact a good thing, or whether some of that spending has actually led to some very negative outcomes for lots of families in lots of areas of the country. Removing incentives, not just to work, but to sustain our families, etc. So that's an interesting situation. There's an organisation that we work with from time to time called Participial, who are real innovators in this area of new forms of social care and new forms of social services. And I'll come on to mention one of the projects in a moment. There's also a really interesting phenomenon with many societies around the world that are reaching a kind of peak of youth populations, so between kind of 15 and 30 or so. So these are some classic examples where people know about the weird kind of population shape of Afghanistan and Egypt, but it's also the same in Turkey, it's the same in lots of other places as well. And it's not so much just that there is a large young population that, if not given productive things to do, can lead to certain crises. I mean, there's a very interesting thesis around some of the civil wars in the kind of west of Africa that suggests, a primary cause in some of those cases was just a lack of traditional structures built around young people, so effectively they have nothing to do. But there's another issue, which is that these people are increasingly highly educated and entering the labour market with expectations that are not substantially different to the expectations of young Finns or young Brits. And why should they be any different? Because they have access to the same information, they have access to the same kind of TV shows on YouTube, etc. And it's a very interesting thing. So one thing I noticed yesterday in the Financial Times, a really interesting long article about workers in Foxconn. And basically, there are hundreds of thousands of people employed in these factories making iPhones and making other technology. And increasingly they're saying, do you know what, this is really boring. Yes, we've had a higher income working in the factory than we had previously, but you know what, the world has changed. We don't need to only be working in these factories, or in India we don't need to only be working in these idiotic call centres for Western companies. We can actually do our own thing. And so there's a trend of people leaving those factories and setting up micro-businesses of their own as agents or employment agents, etc. in this case. And I find that very, very interesting. And I think there will come a time when there is a larger number of people who sit outside both the traditional kind of employment structures and outside the kind of new, Western manufacturing employment structures. And that's going to be a very interesting thing to watch, to see what they do and how they choose to cope with those challenges. Another, I'm sounding really miserable here with all these kind of challenges. I'm sorry, it's only a Tuesday morning, but another issue that we have, I think, is the decline of the kind of classic 20th century kind of corporation. And it's a very interesting thing that throughout the 20th century, the larger companies that we had were quite long-lived. So that's one thing that's changing, is the average lifespan of a major company is declining very, very rapidly. I think the average lifespan now is 15 years, whereas it used to be more than double or triple that figure in the early part of the 20th century. But secondly, the organizational model was kind of predicated on late 19th century management structures, early 20th century management theory, Taylorism, etc., and is singularly incapable of addressing the challenges of the 21st century. So one issue is that costs inside large companies are huge. They're simply almost out of control. It's very hard to do small things profitably in large bureaucratic organizations. But secondly, the workforce is changing, people's expectations are changing, and whereas my father had a job because it was almost, I guess, a religious duty to have a job. You know, everybody must work, you must go to the factory, and there's an expectation that if you do your time in that factory, eventually they'll say goodbye and give you a pension, and you'll be able to live on that pension. That promise is no longer able to be fulfilled by either governments or large companies today. And so that's leading to some of the most talented younger people either becoming portfolio workers or contractors or setting up their own businesses, etc. And that poses a huge challenge for these organizations. If you want to read a case study of the absolute failure of imagination inside these companies, I think Microsoft is a good example. Microsoft is still a successful company. It's not about to collapse or anything like that. But the extent to which they've lost talented people over the last 5 to 10 years is quite extraordinary. And primarily it's because they have a kind of management philosophy which is about always getting rid of the bottom 5 or 10% and insisting that people progress and move in the organization in a hyper-competitive atmosphere, in also a hyper-bureaucratic atmosphere in order to succeed. And the level of pushback now against that philosophy inside the company is absolutely huge. So it's a real challenge for the way that they run their control mechanisms. Another challenge is, to go back to Professor McAfee's book, technology is reducing our reliance on labour. So it's not just about people being replaced by robots in car plants, etc. There is a real danger that we are looking for new forms of productivity that rely less and less on people. So if you look at Twitter, if you look at Facebook, a handful of individuals, I think 65 people in Twitter, can create billions of dollars of value and can create almost a new kind of paradigm of productivity, but without the kind of numbers of individual workers that we've seen in the past. That's one example. It's a bit of an outlier because there aren't that many Twitters or Facebooks in the world. But if you look at Professor McAfee's book, it's an interesting little book, and it does pose some very interesting and quite serious challenges. And I think for me, what this goes back to is that we need to look beyond the standard models of employment in a company or setting up your own company. I think there is a range of mixed models between those two poles that give us some hope that we can find productive things to do for people to sustain themselves in these modern economies. So, I did mention kind of entrepreneurship in the title. It's a very interesting question. What do we mean by entrepreneurship? I think what we've seen in the technology sector in the last 10 years is this kind of reification of startups as a model. My sector is obsessed with creating startups, and the vast majority of those startups will fail, which is no bad thing. But also the vast majority of those startups have no sustainable business plan beyond being sold to Google or being sold to Yahoo or being sold to some other company with an excess of capital derived from their position in the stock markets, basically. And so you have this kind of chain where a secondary market for capital is actually creating VC firms and creating startups at a much faster rate than those companies can actually achieve anything like economic sustainability. And it's great, it's fun, it's a wonderful place to be, and it almost doesn't matter that many of them fail because they're learning and innovating so rapidly that they're creating opportunities for others. But I don't think it's the answer. I don't think a world of a million little game app developer startups is going to rescue the Finnish economy or rescue the UK economy or rescue the European economy. We need to find bridges with more traditional strengths in manufacturing and in industry and in areas where we retain kind of competitive advantage. And I think this raises the question, what's the goal of business? Is the goal of business to maximise profit? Is it to support a nice lifestyle like this guy's doing? Is it to create social value? Or is it some combination of all of those things? If you go back to some of the big old traditional corporates in Europe, if you look at a company like Unilever, for example, or in the UK, if you look at the role of Rowntree and Cadbury's and these kind of industrial barons from a previous era, their goal wasn't simply the maximisation of profit. Their goal was also to achieve a form of social status. So they were rather paternalistic, they tried to look after their workers in a rather old-fashioned way that we may not agree with today. Unilever had a mission of kind of improving health among people that couldn't afford hygienic supplies and equipment, etc., etc. So, the era that we've reached where, it's all about becoming, a financier or a hedge fund manager and buying yachts and being hypermobile and not really living in one place is quite new and quite unique. And I think it poses a lot of threats to the way that we do things. But I think, if we are to understand the role of entrepreneurship in development, we do need to have a conversation about the goals of business, and we do need to allow space for people to have, different goals, not just the goal of exiting or selling the business. Because at the moment, most investment in the VC sector in Europe and America is all aimed at non-lifestyle businesses. In other words, if you can't demonstrate that you can flip the business and sell it to somebody bigger within 4 or 5 years, there are very few investors who are there for the long term, building a kind of new generation of corporates today. Another thing that we've learned in the kind of entrepreneurial world of technology and social technology is this idea that Tim O'Reilly from the United States said, which is create more value than you consume. And he said if you are creating more value than you consume, you will create a kind of sustainable energy within your sector, and you'll create kind of a business ecosystem that will support not just you, but lots of other businesses who can make a profit over from what you've started. So the classic examples there are ecosystem businesses like Twitter and Facebook and so on, where they open up areas of their operation or their APIs or their data to allow this kind of population of smaller businesses around them to create games on Facebook, or to create secondary client tools or secondary data products around Twitter, etc. It's a very interesting. It's a very interesting way of seeing business. And so, rather than operating kind of internally within the four walls of a company, what people are looking at these days is trying to operate more in the open, in a way that you create shared value around your mission, and that can spawn many other businesses as well. And if you think about this idea applied to international development, if you think about this applied to regional regeneration, then you can clearly see the potential for momentum through this form of business. And I think the best example of this is the open source movement. The open source movement is something which doesn't have economic goals at the center. It's something which is about creating great stuff. But it's spawned huge businesses, Red Hat, server businesses, data businesses, software businesses, consultancies, and all through this idea of being open with the value you create so that others can pick it up and run with it. So I think there are some lessons in this recent history of technology and innovation and entrepreneurship to draw on. So I was going to just quote a few, 2 or 3 examples that kind of touch on this area of entrepreneurship and innovation. And one of them actually is a little story about a small town in Bosnia, because it's actually one of the best examples I know of resilience and self-reliance through kind of social networks and social networking. So there's a town called Kozarac. It's near to Banja Luka and Prijedor in Republic of Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And Kozarac in 1992 was ethnically cleansed, completely. So nothing above 3 or 4 bricks high was left standing. The whole place was burned down. A third of the population, about 24,000 people in the town. Most of them were sent to camps. A number of them were killed very directly. In other words, targeting of intellectuals, politicians, doctors, anybody who played a key role in the social network of the town. who could potentially rebuild it was essentially executed. And then after the camps, many people became refugees in Scandinavia, in the UK, in Australia, in America, in Germany, in Austria, Switzerland, etc. And what was really interesting was that they didn't really enjoy the experience of exile, and they were among the most highly motivated in Bosnia to return, even though they lived under quite hostile conditions. So, in other words, the people who oversaw the ethnic cleansing remained in power in this area, and so any attempt to return was extremely dangerous, but also very difficult because there's a high degree of hostility. And what happened was, from maybe 1996, 97, a trickle of people started returning and just living kind of in tents in the town and starting to rebuild things. And eventually, by the late 1990s, that became just enough to sustain life. But they had a key problem, which is that they had structural holes in their social network. They had a whole generation of people missing who they would look to for leadership, and they would look to solve problems and redevelop the town. And one thing that they did, a guy called Chavo, who was a former soldier in the Bosnian army, he set up kind of an online social network called kozrac.ba for Bosnia. And it's kind of like a standard thing. It's got forums, you sign up, you get a profile, you can discuss things, you can have chats, etc., etc. And I did a study about 5 years ago of the content of this online social network over a period of about 18 months. And what was really striking, really interesting, was that they overcame real-world social network damage by recreating bonds in the kind of virtual or the online world. So at this time, you've got probably just a few hundred people who'd returned to the town, but they were connected to a worldwide network in the diaspora of thousands. And every day, people would log on and they would just have a look at a picture of the town. There's almost nothing happening because there's so few people living there. But they would feel connected, and they would have a debate online about how to solve this problem or how to solve that problem. And these debates quickly turned into real-world projects. So a friend of mine, Safko Mugic, who works for the Dutch government, he raised a bunch of money, and they said, hey, the kids have got nowhere to play, so fine, we build a basketball court, we help rebuild the school, we do all these kind of things. And one of the most striking examples was that Kozrac was very proud of its fire service. So they had a 100-year history of this amazing little fire service. And they had a debate on the forum, and then someone said, what the hell, I can go to Germany and buy some fire engines. So they raised some money, and this guy went to Germany, bought some fire engines, came back, and recreated their fire service. Now, if you fast forward a few years, what's really extraordinary is it's become one of the best fire services in the region. And local kind of Serbs who don't necessarily interact with people in Kozarac because of the war, they phone up and say, look, there's a fire. And the local authorities in Prijedor say, well, do you know what? There's a fire service just down the road. And they say, but they're Muslims, how can they possibly put out our fire? And these firemen turn up and say, look, there's no such thing as a Serb fire or a Muslim fire. There's only fire, and we fight fire. And so they've become an amazing kind of reconciliation example in what is an extremely fraught and difficult region. But overall, I mean, the kind of headline of the story is that these people have essentially rebuilt their town partly by having this kind of worldwide view of connected social networks of all the people who used to live in the town. So the town is now both a virtual town in the sense that there are thousands of people who interact with it every day, and it's also a small physical town where people are much more self-reliant and much more in charge of their own development than anywhere else, probably in Bosnia, because they're not addicted to European Union bureaucratic funding. They don't have UN agencies crawling over them. They just do what they need to do to develop the town. So it's kind of an interesting story, and there's a kind of a fuller kind of report and case study on that I can link you to later. A second example that I really like is the work of this organisation, Participial. So they have two projects that are really interesting. One is called the Life Programme. And what that does is it deals with the category of highly damaged, chaotic families in the UK who cost the government around about £35 billion a year in social services, social care, police, justice, welfare, etc., etc. So what you've got is families in the kind of worst housing estates, etc., who individually, on average, cost over £250,000 a year in basic services, but there is no noticeable improvement in their situation. In other words, we spend all that money just to keep them in stasis and avoid complete collapse, rather than to improve their situation or help them in some way. Now, part of the reason for that is the very bureaucratic top-down way in which social services are delivered. So it's all about tick boxes and assessing them, and an individual will come in, won't know what all the other individuals are doing to interact with that family, and so there's lack of coordination. But the big problem is it's not family-centered. You know, the family have no agency in this story. They have no ownership of their situation. And so what Participial did was they launched a project where people go and live with the family for 6 months or so, and they become their kind of advocate and their guide to services. And so they go out and obtain services for them, organise that around the family's need, and actually use some kind of very basic social technology to help the family stay connected with their friends, stay connected with these services and these agents, and also do some planning around their own kind of life goals and life objectives. And the pilot projects have been very, very successful, and the government's kind of looking at this as one way that we can reduce our spending on welfare whilst improving its outcomes. And so we're going to see a few of those popping up around the UK very, very soon. But they have a second project as well, which is about ageing and old people. And in the UK, we treat our old people very, very badly indeed. They are not really respected, they're shunted off into homes, and traditional family structures don't really exist anymore to keep them in their own homes and keep them in families. So Participial run a project called Southwark Circle in one area of London, and it's basically, again, it's a social network, mostly a physical social network, but it does involve some social tech as well, where these old people just, you know, manage their own interactions with others. They club together to help each other, and they club together to raise a little bit of money to buy the things they need for their local community, etc. And it's a very simple idea, but it's been very, very effective in, again, reducing their reliance on the state, but also giving them, you know, a much more kind of bigger sense of agency and a bigger sense of ownership over their own destiny. And in a situation where, you know, old people are increasingly able to continue, you know, kind of 60 is the new 40, as they say. This is really important rather than just kind of forgetting about them. But it also has economic consequences as well, because there are many, many people, you know, in that kind of range of 60 to 80 who are perfectly capable of being productive economically, running little lifestyle businesses, you know, earning some money through the time that they have. That currently is wasted. So these projects, I think, are really interesting in enabling that to happen. I mentioned earlier this idea of kind of ecosystem businesses, and I think in terms of finding examples of new forms of entrepreneurship, this is a really rich sort of area. So APIs, kind of technical term for, you know, data interfaces between systems and products. So Twitter has an API that means that I can build a new product based on Twitter by connecting via this API. So it's a way of, you know, making your business kind of connectable and extendable by others. There's been a really dramatic rise in open APIs in the technology sector, and it has led to a whole range of interesting businesses, and I think that's a category that's really worth looking at in a lot more depth. Another interesting one is what I would call long-tail lifestyle micro businesses, which is a very long way of saying people making money out of YouTube videos of their children laughing and saying silly things. You'd be amazed how many people sustain themselves by advertising revenue from YouTube. It's quite a phenomenon. So if your little sweet child happens to say something hilariously funny on a video and you publish it and 1 million people view it, well, guess what? You're going to make some money. And actually many people have realized this, and they actually start to make their own businesses around this phenomenon. And it's not just YouTube. If you look at things like Etsy, which is a worldwide kind of community for craft and art and craft people, so people that make little dolls or, you know, necklaces or whatever, they're able to sustain themselves with a very, very long tail business. In other words, you know, you would never really set up a store in the centre of Helsinki selling this, because there's not enough people that would buy it to support you. But if you do it in a very low cost way in a community like Etsy, and you do it globally, actually you can make a business out of it. And then there are examples like this guy, Fred. I discovered him through my daughters. He just started making silly videos on YouTube, and he's now, got his own kind of TV show. He's got his own deals with major networks, and he is quite a phenomenon. I mean, millions and millions of people. It's like 1.9 million subscribers just to this channel on YouTube, and that's not the only thing he does. So it's amazing how these kind of wide, large-scale systems are enabling a whole range of little niches that are almost invisible. You kind of don't see them, you don't focus on them, but actually they have great economic potential. And so for people that want to just sustain themselves, want to do a blend of kind of home working and entrepreneurship, it provides some interesting opportunities. Another example is obviously the rise of portfolio workers. This is not entirely new, nor is it entirely related to social technology. But again, you dig into it and you'll find that there are so many people who would normally just be going into a big company and working there for 10 or 20 years, who are not doing that anymore, but they're building through their own kind of social networks a series of contacts that allow them to do a bit of work here, go on holiday for 3 months, do a bit of work there, etc., etc. And it's really interesting as a model. And again, when we look to things like regeneration projects and we look to development projects, we need to think a bit outside the box and not just try and get people into employment or get people starting businesses, but they can do things like this, which is somewhere in the middle. And finally, on the kind of social tech side, I think another great phenomenon we've seen is new forms of funding. So there are things like Kickstarter, there are things like crowdfunding, where anybody can put up an idea and say, hey, I'm going to build this app, and if I need $20,000 and I need maybe 100 people who will work with me and test it, and if I get to those goals, then I'll make the app. And so you can actually raise funds without the commitment of building the app in the first place. And for things like art projects and books and things you want to commission, this has opened up a really wide area for people to play in that they couldn't previously play in. But then there are also things like this. There's a cartoon online called The Oatmeal. It's just a cartoon. The guy is a cartoonist. It's kind of a funny thing. And he got really into Nikola Tesla, the kind of inventor who battled with Edison over AC/DC power in the United States and developed loads of other technologies as well. And he got obsessed with the idea that Tesla was kind of the ultimate geek. And he decided, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we built a Tesla museum? And he discovered that one of the sites that Tesla worked on in the United States was up for sale. And almost as a joke, he said, I need to raise $750 million, I think, $850,000. And if I raise that, New York State will match fund that, and then we can actually buy this site and make a museum. Within, I think it was like maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks at most, he raised $1.3 million. This is a cartoonist. And he raises that money, which is also, by the way, matched by New York State, and then it's also matched by another private benefactor, it turned out later. And so now they have enough money to not only buy the site, but build the museum as well, which is kind of astonishing. You'd never imagine a cartoonist being able to do this 10 or 20 years ago. And so these new funding models are really quite exciting. I love looking at Kickstarter and seeing projects like this. Hey, I'm going to build a plasma jet electric thruster for a spacecraft. It's kind of wild, it's wacky, but people are out there sharing their passions and finding others who believe in what they're doing and finding others who are passionate about what they're doing. And that's enabling them to get started with some crazy stuff. So I think, again, whenever we're thinking about the future of entrepreneurship, we also need to be thinking about the future of funding, because there are way too many people who still think the only route to funding is to go to the VC, to write some ridiculous business plan that says year 1, nothing, year 2, something, year 3, everything. And this kind of hockey stick graph that is in every pitch deck for funding. And that's really not the answer, because those VCs, they want 3 times, 4 times, 5 times money, and they want that within 3 years or 5 years. What they're not interested in doing is funding that guy on the beach that we saw, who's productive, economically active, but not going to sell his company to Google. The other thing that I think we can't ignore these days when thinking about the role of entrepreneurship in innovation is this kind of big data trend that's going on right now. It's a bit of a cliche, everybody's talking about it, but it is very real. So what's happening is that if we kind of apply our big kind of listening machines to the world of online social interaction, there is so much information that's being voluntarily shared by people that we can use to, first of all, find niches which are unfulfilled and fill them quickly. But secondly, sample demand for products or services and better orient our products and services to deliver against that demand. But third, also deliver better public services. I mean, you know, the great tragedy of most government spending, certainly in the UK, is that it's all supply driven. It's not really demand led. So there'll be some political initiative and it will go through Parliament, and a year later they'll create some bureaucratic nightmare of an organisation, and then they'll plough money into it and they'll spend millions and millions, you know, based on a theory or based on their idea of what people should want, only then to discover that that's not the reality, and much of that money's been wasted, or it's just gone to corrupt contractors or whatever it might be. And if you actually listen, if you sample demand for public services, if you sample, you know, people's issues and problems in society, etc., it's entirely possible that you can use that to better fine-tune the services you deliver, which I think can reduce costs, but also, more importantly, deliver better services. There are a few examples of how this is opening up new economic opportunities. You know, things like Klarna, which is a Swedish company, online shopping innovation, where people can go to a website and based on a very quick real-time data analysis of that person, they will let a seller give them something, and then they will fulfill the invoice in the background. So it's like a trust system, but it's based on verification through data. So they think their algorithms are good enough that at the point of purchase, they can pretty much decide whether you're good for the credit, and then they will then simplify your shopping experience because you can just get the goods more quickly, and then in the background they'll go around and collect the money. And they believe that, you know, the losses that they might make on bad debts there are outweighed by the money that they make from the companies selling it. So it's just one of a million examples where applying big data and listening and kind of number crunching to things we already do can create new forms of businesses that weren't there before. And I guess the other big trend that you can't avoid mentioning these days is this idea of 3D printing and kind of making things. One of the things about working in the internet sector for a long time is that you desperately want to work with physical objects. You get extremely bored just working with bits and pixels on a screen. And so many of the early innovators in certainly London have become what we call post-digital. So they're looking for hybrids of physical and virtual objects and physical and virtual worlds. One example is Alice Taylor, pretty smart woman, used to commission kind of social tech for Channel 4. So she's built this business called Makeys, where you go online and you kind of design your doll, give it facial features, give it a personality, and then they print it individually, just one of them, using 3D printing. A bit expensive, it was £99 for a doll, so my kids won't be getting one anytime soon until they work out the economies of scale on that one. But this idea of kind of user-led innovation and mass customization is really interesting. You know, it will be possible very soon to, you know, print your own object that's personalized just for you. And that's a world away from the kind of mass market systems of the 20th century. So it's something I find kind of interesting. So I've been kind of rambling through a few things that interest me. They probably don't interest many of you in terms of entrepreneurship and its role in innovation. But I wanted just to offer a few kind of concluding thoughts as well. The first one is never waste a good crisis. You know, what a fantastic time to be innovating and trying to solve big problems. I always love this picture of the Berlin airlift because, you know, that was one of those examples where necessity really is the mother of invention. You know, people said, how the hell are you going to supply the city? It's impossible. And some cigar-chomping American general just said, screw it, we'll just fly planes non-stop, 24 hours a day, until we solve the problem. And in so doing, they had to invent the basic rules of logistics. And so if you look at the way FedEx operates, you look at the way UPS operates, all of these kind of global logistics companies, many of them have their roots, their methods, their ways of working in the Berlin airlift. So it's one of those great examples where a real need creates innovation because you have to solve a problem. And if you go back to the story about this town, Kozarac in Bosnia, you know, it's another great example. They simply did not have a choice but to rebuild their own town. and they found a way of doing that that relied on their own social networks and their own kind of resilience as well. So I think it's a really interesting time to be focusing on innovation and focusing on entrepreneurship today. I think, you know, the basic organizing principle now is not process and bureaucracy. It's not analysis ahead of time and then a tick box of, you know, what's the right thing to do. Networks are our organizing principles. So networks are at the heart of everything we do. If we design an organization, if we design a development program, if we design an urban regeneration plan, it's all about the networks. It's pretty much, you know, a fundamental these days. And I think our new superpower, which we're only just starting to play with and learn the capacity of, is this idea of networks plus common purpose. You know, if you have networks and a bunch of people who are motivated to solve a problem, they can do pretty much anything. And so the role of organizations should be, first of all, maybe to get out of the way and not, you know, try and impose order on that process, but secondly, to understand the dynamics of that process. And so if you want to assist within the network. Don't assist by trying to take things over into your own kind of government-funded program, for example. Blended models. I used to be fascinated by these animals when I was a kid. Actually, we call them a zedonk in the UK. It's a mixture of a donkey and a zebra. Just amazed me. I used to go to zoos just to see them. But all I mean by that picture is that these blended models of entrepreneurship are really important. You know, let's not design programs that are going to get people into employment if they don't necessarily want to get into employment. Let's not make everybody become a game startup and go to VCs pitching for money. You know, let's look at blended models. You know, do we need growth, or are people happy just to sustain themselves in certain environments? If they're happy to sustain themselves and easily solve the problem, there's plenty of opportunities in the new economy for them to do that. And I think, you know, beware of the law of unintended consequences. When you try to help, and also impose order on a situation, you can often fail very, very badly. And it's been really interesting to look at a recent kind of backlash against the whole aid industry. It's in the UK. I don't know whether you have the same debate here, but there was a study just this week about Canadian international development aid to Afghanistan and Iraq in the post-war scenario. And it was just a monumental failure in every sense. I mean, it produced corruption, primarily on their own side, not on the Afghan or the Iraqi side. I mean, the first corruption was really their own companies, their own consultants, their own contractors who, you know, fed off this kind of trough of government funding, but also bred corruption on the other side as well. It didn't work in any way, shape or form. It was highly ineffective. And you have to ask yourself, why don't you just kind of give the money to people at the end? You know, why don't you just go and, you might as well just go and drop the cash on the floor. You'd have a better outcome than actually trying to design programs around it. And in the UK, you know, we've got this whole kind of world of consultants who now people are looking into and saying, well, hold on. The idea of aid is not to enrich consultants in the UK, it's to actually help communities in other countries. And I think this is, you know, this is an interesting paradox. If we want to develop an area, if we want to develop a country, if we want to develop a sector, you know, what do you do that doesn't turn it into kind of a corrupt jamboree? We have in the UK this thing called Tech City. It's in the east of London, and what was going on was there was a natural coming together of tech companies in this area, and it was, you know, entirely kind of authentic and self-led. And then the government decided they wanted a slice of the action, so they built a kind of an investment company that they put on top. And the investment company spends a fortune on websites and a fortune on conferences and, you know, all this kind of stuff. They burn through their money very, very quickly. Did it have an impact on the area? Maybe a little bit, but actually it was happening anyway. So, you know, you've got to ask yourself whether that kind of intervention is pro-entrepreneurship or actually that's acting against the necessary preconditions for entrepreneurship, which are, you know, A, not having much money in the bank, kind of focuses the mind, and B, having a problem to solve. So this is not kind of a, you know, a public-private argument or a left-right argument or anything else. It's purely an argument about effectiveness, but it's something that I think when governments and, you know, God forbid even the European Union turn up and try and help the sector, it can be quite scary. I was doing a little bit of advisory work for the European Union, and pretty much every time they said, you know, hey, this sector's fascinating, what can we do? And it was just like, please turn around, walk away, and pretend you've never seen it. Because there's nothing that you can do within a real-time cycle, that will have an impact this year, not in 5 years' time, that's not going to destroy a whole bunch of naturally occurring entrepreneurial activity. So anyway, over to you. What does this mean? What does this mean for the work that you do? What does this mean for the projects that you're interested in on the global side? But also, what does it mean for for Finland and for kind of the entrepreneurial scene and the innovation scene in Finland? Luckily, I don't know the answer to that. So there's a degree of social pressure on each of you now to perhaps answer that question or come up with something smart to say. So that's all I wanted to say. I think we've got plenty of time for discussion and questions, and maybe some questions coming from your machine, I don't know. But thank you for listening to my rambling.
Thanks for a lot of provoking thoughts, and I think that part of us are resonating with them and part of us are probably having questions that they want to address you. I think that I would first like to hand over to the audience here if you have anything that you want to comment to me or that you want to ask or add from your own sides. Yes. Just Bryant and Ed.
Just to continue, you wrapped up very excellently the principles of organization. You explain how we came from the principle of structure to process and now network. Could you, in a similar way, elaborate the principle of coordination or steering or management, when we think that historically we had the coordinating efforts were fiat, hierarchical coordination or competition. So how would you articulate this coordinating?
It's a great question. It's a really great question. So if you go back to, for example, the way companies operated, I always think the basic idea of a 20th century company was that they hated their employees and they believed their employees hated them. So everything was really about control mechanisms to make them clock in and clock out, make them only do what they're told, operation by kind of memo, which has become operation by email, and trying to avoid failure based on people not really doing the right thing. And that's a very expensive way of organising human activity, and you get very little value out of it because people don't care enough to go the extra mile or do stuff that they're passionate about. And so these days, I think there's a greater level of comfort with the idea of trusting people more. So in other words, hiring the right people, giving them the right tools and the right training, and then kind of letting them organize, between themselves, create their own networks, create their own ways of delivering projects, etc., which in terms of management is a much cheaper way of running an organization, but also has a potential to get more value from people. Because if you go into a startup, you'll see people working 12, 14-hour days. There was a great case study actually online yesterday about the early days of Skype. So it was written by the third employee of Skype. And she said, it's just, we were working 24 hours a day, and we were days away from launching the whole kind of paid calling service. We were making it up. We were writing pricing in spreadsheets, the night before. It was just a huge flurry of activity. And you never see that in a company. You only see that in a company, in a large company, based on fear or based on a realistic prospect of hyper returns for one or two individuals concerned. So if it's bonus time, etc., you might get something like that kind of activity. So very different modes in terms of the value that they get from labour in one structure and the other structure. Now, what does that mean for management? What does that mean for coordination, as you said? We talk about the idea of network-centric management, learning how to apply the real traditional strengths of leadership in a network-centric world. So one example would be, in the old days, people do nothing until you tell them to do something. So as a manager, you're just kind of choke point in the process where you say, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this. These days, a lot of it is management by exception. So people get on and do their work unless you intervene and say, that's wrong, please stop. And again, it doesn't take a genius to work out that's a cheaper and more effective way of intervening in the work that people are doing. So we have a lot to learn about network-centric management. I think business schools and a lot of the traditional education are not yet really geared up for that. But if we can learn about that, then there is real strength in traditional leaders. There are people who are very charismatic, they're very influential, they're very smart, and they're very good at inspiring other people to act. And actually, in large organizations, they often only talk to the 6 or 8 managers around them, whereas they want to be more present in the whole organization. They want to be a force of inspiration. And through social technology, but also through these other ways of thinking about management, they can. And so they can be more effective as leaders in that sort of world. But there's another side to that, which is moving from a kind of mechanical model of organizations to a more kind of organic model of organizations. We have in the UK the National Health Service, which people always joke is it's one of the biggest kind of organizations in the world. It's almost like the Red Army, in kind of size, and it's run as if it were a machine. In other words, they think that if you put $1 million in here, you'll get value out the other end. And it's absolutely not the case. It's such a huge operation, and it's so kind of Byzantine in nature that you cannot manage it in a purely top-down way. And many of the failures we've had in recent years are failures of imagination in management thinking. So we set targets, for certain things, but not for other things, and then people just work to those targets, but it doesn't really improve the health outcomes. It just means they're hitting certain targets and they're bending the system to make sure they do. So what we're seeing now is people start to talk about complex adaptive systems, and they're saying, well, if you treat this organization as a kind of a complex system rather than a machine, then you may not be able to manage it overall, but you can set some goals, you can set some parameters, some boundaries and attractors, and you can influence behavior in the system. But you have to accept that basically people need to be influenced. There's a limit to what you can do by coercion. And if you are able to do that and operate in a kind of influence through networks way, then you can achieve really positive outcomes. And you can encourage good behaviors, discourage bad behaviors, and overall you can have the impact that you want as a manager, but from a different point of view. So I think to summarize, it's partly about thinking about complexity and complex systems, and B, I think it's a new approach to management thinking that doesn't believe that top-down outcomes are always guaranteed. Actually, you need to operate within the system in order to influence its behaviour.
Thanks. Very good ideas. Eva, please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Eva. I'm a PhD student in Aalto University School of Business. I have one comment and one question. You mentioned this that crisis is a possibility, and I tend to agree to some extent, but I also feel a bit awkward since in a crisis I think human beings are always, their lives are influenced and they are sometimes really miserable. So seeing the situations as a possibility sometimes, like looking at it from that perspective might seem a bit cold. Or, yes, that's what I was thinking. But my question is though, I just had yesterday a heated debate over the similar topics that you were discussing just earlier. To what extent is, what is more important, to prevent the free riding or to enable more activities? Because the person that I was debating, he was saying that he doesn't want any free riders anywhere in the system. And what I was saying that free riders you cannot avoid them if you want to encourage people to do things. Yeah, and so we couldn't end up this debate yesterday.
I mean, my perspective on that would be, if free riders kind of damage value for others, in other words, if they have a high cost, then it's an issue. But if they don't have a high cost, free riders bring lots and lots of benefits. So if you think about, biological organisms, and you think about human body, it's not really one thing. It's like this loose association of all kinds of different creatures and bugs and bacteria and everything else, and we're absolutely jam-packed full of free riders. And some of them kill us from time to time, and some of them actually make us stronger. But they're all a key part of what makes us evolve and what makes us develop. And so usually in most systems, we've been taught this model of efficiency where you shouldn't have redundancy and you shouldn't have bits that apparently do something that we don't know what it is. But then if you look at the human DNA, probably the majority of that stuff we don't fully understand. We can sequence it, etc. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that we've traditionally thought of as junk DNA that doesn't do anything, but actually just means we don't yet understand what it does. So there's nothing wrong with redundancy and free riders in a system, as long as they don't become so powerful that they kind of overwhelm the host, so to speak. You can get a lot of innovation out of free riders, and I think that's one of the great lessons of kind of technological innovation in the last 10 years, is that the cost of so many things has gone down so quickly that it does bring an influx of economic actors who would not otherwise be incentivized to operate in that field. And they may invent things, they may teach you things, they may, even your countermeasures against free riders may become a business opportunity. If you look at security software, for example, and antivirus software and anti-spam software, it's all part of an ecosystem. And so you shouldn't seek to design the optimum machine with no redundancy or free riders. I think it's good to see those as an opportunity as well. And yet, I'm not in favour of crises, just to disambiguate that point. In an ideal world, we wouldn't have one, but crises also bring lots of opportunities as well. So we shouldn't be afraid, despite the human cost of these issues, we shouldn't be afraid of trying to innovate our way out of them.
Yes, please.
Yes, hi. Building on what you said, that the 20th century corporation as a machine is basically dead. So what about the 20th century government machine?
Yeah, it's basically dead. What can you say? I mean, if you look at the UK, we have the three main political parties have never been more pathetic. I can't remember a time when no one has any faith in any of them. They're embarrassing. They're not even competent, let alone visionary or insightful. And they're afraid because I'm not even sure they want to run the country. They don't know quite how to run the country anymore because we've kind of outsourced so much, and the financial sector is more powerful than than most parts of government. And so it's clearly not a model that's working particularly well. But it's actually really hard to see how we jump from that to new models. I think there's a process of devolution that's been going on for quite a while, and probably that's the answer ultimately, is that you just continue devolving things down to more local and smaller kind of levels and contexts, and then people are at least incentivized to fix problems and to do things in the right way. But it's very hard to see what the future of government is. And the 20th century was not a great time for political ideologies, really. I mean, any half-decent political ideology probably killed multiple millions of innocent people at some point or other. And so the idea of these big systemic, states and big systemic governments, hopefully we're kind of over that to a large extent. But then, on a practical level, how the governments operate, how do they operate in a networked world? How do they influence things rather than try and control things? I think we're 20, 30 years away from even beginning to understand those questions.
So you are in essence saying that also the governments need to reinvent themselves and need completely new paradigms?
we need to reinvent the governments, I think. I don't think they can reinvent themselves because, it's one of those, again, a paradox. People tend to work in the government for, 5 years. Maybe 2 terms, 10 years, but all change takes more than 10 years. So, they can't even begin that process because they won't see any results or benefits, and so they're incentivized from seeking meaningful change like that. So it's tricky. I just think that gradually they will be softened and kind of networked, and their powers will start to kind of bleed outwards slightly. So it becomes a blend. They become a centre of activity, not government itself. It involves people. I mean, one of the things, if you look at the economic challenges of government, one of the things I've always been really interested in is how government can actually reduce costs by placing those costs on citizens. And I know that sounds kind of cruel. It sounds like not the kind of thing you would do in Scandinavia or Finland, for example. But if you look at healthcare, if I go to the doctor, I want to be part of the process of care. I'm an annoying kind of Googler. I've probably Googled, 200 papers about this potential condition, whereas the doctor may have spent 2 days in medical school 10 years ago working in that condition. I want to bear some of the cost of that process. You know, I want to be an actor. I don't want them to do it to me. And surely that's a way of reducing their costs, because I can bear some of that cost, and I'm quite happy to bear that cost for a better outcome. And I think there are many examples like that where participation by citizens, you know, is a good thing anyway, but it's also a way of deferring costs for central government, because a lot of what central government does is, you know, kind of absurdly expensive in today's context. It's not really an argument for smaller government. You know, it's not kind of US Republican position I'm trying to lay out here, but it's certainly an argument for more connected government and more involving government. But honestly, I don't really know where to begin to, you know, to make that happen.
Sarah, did you have a question?
Yes, maybe just a small question. Last summer I heard a speak by check his name Kentaro Toyama would be working with, do you know him? Some about he had been working with was it Microsoft or some company. Anyway, he had been a big technology developer, and now he was kind of saying technology is dead, and you know we have to look at the human. And I just wanted to I could hear that in your presentation. I'd be interested in hearing just a little bit more about where are the pitfalls in that industry of somehow over-focusing on technology and this individual. How can you overcome that? You already talked about the human capabilities. I'd love to hear a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important. I think I would kind of share that view that, you know, the most interesting thing is human. And it's about what we can do individually and collectively. And even people, you know, I'm not so much into this, but people are talking about kind of, you know, augmented humans. So one of the reasons that Geeks was so excited by the Paralympics in London was this idea that these people are like post-human, you know, they're kind of part human, part machine, you know, with kind of metal legs and extra kind of pieces and all this kind of stuff. And there is a whole kind of body of thought about augmentation of humans, which is slightly scary, but kind of interesting at the same time. I'm more of an old-fashioned kind of just pro-human person, so I just think that humans have the most incredible capability to achieve things, to invent things, and to do things for themselves. And, you know, our history of being able to do that is so recent that we shouldn't take it for granted. You know, it really isn't a long time ago that, you know, Finland was in a completely different situation, you know, in the Second World War between Germany and Russia and all this kind of stuff. It's also not long ago that, you know, in the UK I would have been working in a factory, you know, my whole life without the opportunities that I've had. And the opportunities that I've had as a person are actually all about technology, you know, so I'm lucky that, you know, I never wanted a job, don't care about money, you know, don't follow rules, and the internet was there every step I took to pretend that that's a viable position. Whereas my father was telling me all through my childhood, you can't do this, it's not going to work, you know, it's not how the world works. But luckily the world changed, and so you're able to just do what you want and find these opportunities. So I think it's not about technology versus, you know, humans, or is one more important than the other. So much of our human potential now has actually been enabled by changes in society, changes in ideas, but also changes in technology. And that, for me, is the kind of exciting nexus, you know, between the two. So I think it's why social technology, you know, I find so interesting, because it's not about pursuing technology goals, it's about pursuing human goals, but through technology. So, you know, it's easy for this debate to become polarized between, you know, pro or anti-technology, but I think it's kind of both. You know, the whole history of humanity is that, you know, from the printing press through to, you know, everything that's changed materially our reality, in a way, is a technological innovation. You know? And so that's something that I think will continue to be interesting and exciting for a long time.
Since I don't see any hands up now, I want to ask a question that I've been thinking of from about the midst of your presentation, which is that, you know, in a way there are always those people like you, or probably many here in the audience, who sort of, you know, almost no matter in which position they are in the world, in the current world, they are kind of able to either build their new micro businesses or doing some sort of creative search of activity, which is sort of in the fuzzy blended area somewhere. But I still can't help thinking that there are so many people who don't have that kind of character and capabilities.
And opportunities.
And opportunities also. And I'm just thinking, the huge amount of jobs that we have all over the world, but if we only speak of, let's say, UK, Finland, Western Europe in general, in agriculture, all the migrant workers doing really work in crappy conditions with almost no salary, or the same goes for part of the restaurant business, or cleaning, which is like basically work which you can't just do with machines and with technology, or if you do, it's going to be very expensive actually compared to the human beings. And while you've been speaking, and you had the Participial example and so on, which is basically about marginalized people, but still I feel that there is this huge group of people that are kind of invisible to us, and where I think that at least myself, I feel that my hands are really tied in thinking of what to do with that kind of manual labor, where the conditions probably are getting actually worse, at least if you think in European scene now, while we have this opportunity of getting the migrant workers and who have no rights and sometimes not even permission.
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a big challenge. I mean, I guess the way we all look at that in some ways is that there's a whole bunch of these jobs that arguably need to be done, but actually don't need to be done in quite such a low-cost way. So in the UK, one of the effects of the rapid rise of commodity prices and food prices over the last few years has actually led to increasing prosperity among farmers, for example. And so you wonder, we used to pay, I think I heard a statistic the other day that on average in the UK we used to spend, I think, a third of our budget on food, and now we spend about 10% or less on food. And you're kind of thinking, well, maybe some of these things should be more expensive, and then actually there is a proper job to be sustained in farming, rather than the kind of soul-destroying, kind of subsistence-only level that we've got used to. So obviously, in so many ways, a lot of our economic development has been predicated on the colonisation of others. Certainly for the UK, it's very, very true. And so maybe there are just certain areas where costs have to increase if there is a sustainable answer to people working in those kind of roles. But there's another dimension as well, which is that you have waves of people who do the subsistence stuff as a route to something else. So the wage differential between Mexico and China in the outsourcing phase was like, I forget what the exact stat is, but it's about 75 cents an hour in China, and it was about 160 in Mexico. Now it's more like 163 in China and $2 in Mexico. So this gap, this wage gap, has narrowed very, very rapidly. And yes, okay, Mexicans still poor relative to Americans and go and work, picking fruit in California, etc. But actually, the Reconquista that the Mexicans talk about is actually Mexican investment money moving to the United States. So the Mexican economy has kind of shifted from being based around that sort of stuff to, yes, still having a lot of that stuff, but actually it's shifting rightwards and becoming more similar to the US economy. And so once Mexicans are prosperous enough not to go and pick fruit, somebody else will be brought in to pick fruit. So there's kind of waves of this sort of subsistence as a first step towards more meaningful economic activity. And I think where it gets really worrying is if you look at Africa and you look at the way that land is being bought up by companies, for no other purpose than speculation. That's worrying, because it's not that they're working somewhere else, that's their land, that is kind of Africa. And if people end up being like serfs you know, in their own territory, owned by Chinese companies or American companies, then it's very worrying. But you know, it's a fact of life that there are these subsistence jobs, and a whole bunch of people are going to do them. And actually, it may well be the only opportunity they have at certain points in their cycle. So, you know, on the one hand, you hope that you can raise costs, do the kind of fair trade thing on a bigger scale. You know, we've done the thing with milk in the UK. Milk was always sold at a loss, and farmers literally lose money on every pint of milk, so the industry was threatened. And so we've had to go back and look at it and increase the costs so that it's sustainable. So you hope that some of that can happen, but then you also hope that the people in the subsistence bucket are not there for long. You know, that they can somehow use that as a route to other things. And if you look at Africa in particular, the innovative and entrepreneurial potential in Africa is just massive. I mean, it's one of the most untapped resources, you know, the world has. I mean, look at the mobile phone sector alone. You know, I throw away iPhones. You know, I mean, they're still worth £30 or £40 or £50, the old ones, to recycle, but pretty much, you know, they're almost disposable to me, which is shameful. I am ashamed of that. But in Africa, you can take the cheapest mobile phones and you can actually build an ecosystem where 3 or 4 levels of individual are making money, tiny amounts of money, from the contract or from the phone or from selling the SIM or from recharging or whatever. So they have an ability to extract value at much lower levels of economic activity than anyone in Europe is able to do. I know a guy in Sweden who, when people throw away all of their TVs and their electrical white goods, he gathers them, takes them from tips, and they get sent progressively through Turkey and Afghanistan, and they get stripped and stripped and stripped and stripped. And people are actually extracting value from even the most basic components all along the way. So there is this ability to be economically kind of ingenious as a way of solving problems that is natural when you don't have much, and certainly it's there in Africa. And so rather than buy up all the land and kind of condemn them to a life of subsistence agriculture, you know, if we're smart, we should be kind of investing in micro businesses and micro lending there and letting people kind of find ways out of that. And then we can solve the who picks the fruit, who picks the corn question, you know, another way. And if that way means that we spend 30% of our income on food instead of 10%, well, so be it. It's food we need to eat, you know, so it's not a problem. But yeah, it is a big issue, and it's easy to get so enamored with our little world of technology and goodness that, you know, we forget that that's partly on the backs of, you know, lots of other people who don't have those opportunities.
Yeah, I very much, you know, share your opinion. And in terms of this kind of things that you are saying, that people can move over from subsistence and they can get those little funds and skills and so on that they can use elsewhere. And kind of, I see the positive trend with much of what is happening, but at the same time I'm kind of asking, like, are all the good solutions going to come from this voluntary process where, you know, people just have the opportunities and they should have even more opportunities and then it's going to work out, or whether there should be other types of processes or mechanisms aside which are actually trying to make more sure that there is no land grabbing in Africa, or or you know, that there should be more fair trade and more kind of workers' rights.
Yeah, everybody accepts that murder is wrong. Everybody accepts that there is a notion of crimes of humanity that are kind of a global thing, and you know, it's not relative. It's not like, oh, my culture allows us to kill people, yours doesn't. You know, there are some basics we all agree on, and so I think one of the basics we should also all agree on is that kind of the worst kind of colonial robbery should not be allowed in the global system, you know, as a whole. You know, we've got to have some rules. Otherwise, there will always be, you know, your free riders and people who will exploit others. But there are so many other parts of the equation. It's not all a Western guilt issue either. You know, it's failures of states. It's also failures of traditional communities and community values. You know, we're all like, oh, you know, we love traditional communities. I don't. You know, I don't think they're always good. They can suppress human potential and do horrible things to groups of individuals. So, you know, you don't need to somehow put them on a pedestal and think that everything they do is good. education, you know, there was a piece I read this week about kind of a little experiment in Ethiopia giving iPads directly to kids in a village. And it builds on the work of Sugata Mitra and this Hole in the Wall project that maybe I mentioned before. You know, it's just amazing. Basically, you know, no school is better than a bad school. You know, no school plus the internet is a far more effective way of educating people than bad schools. And so, you know, what are we doing to ensure kind of global access to the kind of educational materials that we take for granted? You know, that alone can lift, you know, so many people out of subsistence and out of poverty, if there are opportunities for them to use that at the end of the line. But that's happening. You know, even, you know, there's not that many areas of Africa where today there's no access to some kind of entrepreneurial activity. There's a hell of an economy being built there in the world.
What about the roles of chaotic families in the do you really see corporate social responsibility having a big role?
Maybe you can speak up.
Sorry, you talked about the chaotic families in Britain. How do you see the role of corporate social responsibility in that? I remain a bit skeptical about it.
Yeah, no, I don't
giving them agency.
Well, when you say corporate social responsibility, I don't mean to imply that companies, you know, have a role to play in solving the problems of those families. The example there was just a different way of delivering state services to those families. But I think the interesting debate there, and this is where it gets very politically dangerous, is the debate about welfareism in the UK. You know, the left would absolutely say that, you know, welfare should always be higher, and you just give it, give it, give it. And the right would say, well, the reason those families are in that chaotic state is because they haven't, for 2 generations, they've not needed to work. They've not needed to solve their own problems. And so the level of drug abuse, alcoholism, you know, kind of family breakdown, etc., 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 is much higher than you would expect in, you know, families where you have to work to support yourself, etc. So that's a debate I don't really want to get into because it's very fraught on both sides. But you know, solving that problem is not, you know, it's posed as an economic question, but really it's a social problem. When people have no dignity and when people are not in control of their lives, it's just the worst. It's the worst experience. It's the worst place to be. And if you bring up children in that environment as well, who have, you know, no experience of being able to take control of their lives, it's very damaging. It's very damaging for society. So I think we shouldn't be afraid of, you know, addressing the question. And you know, I hope you can do it by putting those families in control rather than doing things to them. You know, which is the kind of worst aspects of the paternalistic welfare state that we saw in maybe the 60s and 70s. I mean, there were, you know, terrible examples in Sweden, for example, of, you know, almost eugenic movements where you believe that there were certain people who were just not good enough to be in society, forced sterilisation, and, you know, all this kind of thing. You know, that's thank God behind us. So you've got to have a solution that gives the families some incentive, you know, and some path to taking control of their lives. What's the basis of your doubts and your skepticism?
You didn't really open up the project very much. How you said that life project gives agency to the people. You didn't open up the project very much.
Okay, no, it's not really it's not my project. You know, we've just worked on a project with them. But I mean, basically, it's actually a very simple philosophy. The philosophy is, at the moment, there's like 20 different agencies of the state doing things to the family. And if you analyse the time that social workers spend in families, 75% of the time is spent filling in forms. So they don't really get to know the family. They're just, you know, tick, 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 tick. You know, it's a mechanistic way of dealing with human problems. And so their thing is they send a really energetic former social worker to go and live with the family for a period of time and say, look, I'm on your side. You know, whenever someone comes through the door from the government, you know, let's sit down and I'll help you deal with them and we'll decide what you need, what you don't need, etc., etc. But at the same time, hey, let's try and make a plan and see how you can, you know, you can create your own plan for improving your situation. So that's basically the idea. and then they act as kind of advocates in dealing with all of these disconnected agencies, until eventually you build a little team around the family. So people that do know them and can personalise their experience of social care. And the result is that you need a lot less police involvement, you need a lot less healthcare involvement, so you're reducing the cost of dealing with that family whilst also improving their experience. That's the theory, and the evidence so far seems to be quite positive, but it's just an experiment in that sense. It's not necessarily an answer to everything.
What about in practice? Is it really that social worker is going to live in the family, in the same home, or they just visit there, stay hours?
I think in the pilot they more or less lived with them for a period of time, and then obviously you start to withdraw slightly. But when you've built some kind of a system for dealing with all of these agencies, etc., so then you start to pull back, and then basically you're always on call. So, our part of this was to build like a really simple little system that they could use just to reflect on the experience, but also to contact people, because, picking up the phone to a social worker and kind of talking about a problem, it's quite daunting, it's quite challenging, but if you feel that you're somehow connected in a little social network with these people, so you're kind of always sharing something with them, and you can just text them or you can just say hello, etc., then it's a more effective form of communication. I think that's one of the things that that works better. But it's really, I think, all part of this idea that we need more personalised, individual approaches to delivering social care, rather than just this mass approach where everybody gets the same experience, and you have professionals who judge you and can diagnose you, etc., etc. It really does start to destroy their own sense of being in control of their lives. So it's an interesting approach. It's just one idea.
And maybe it's also useful here to distinguish between different types of enterprises. For instance, between social enterprises and large corporations. I think that one of the things why we are quite confused at the moment is that there has been all these series of articles in our main daily in the newspaper of these large healthcare and elderly care companies, to whom much of our healthcare and elderly care has been outsourced, who are doing very aggressive tax planning, shifting much of the money out of the country, and actually there is a great sort of fear, I think, amongst people that actually what they are doing is little by little lowering the service level in order to always make higher and higher profits. And I think that in this case, in the Participial example case, it might be nice to learn as a background of whether that's sort of a smaller, more social type of enterprise, or whether it's kind of a corporation owned by capital.
It's very much a social enterprise, and it's quite small scale, and they really struggle with money. But I think what's really interesting about them is that they have a strong element of design thinking in the organisation. So they've got some leads, like Hilary Hutton is a leading thinker on kind of design thinking. So I find that very interesting, because that's part of their philosophy, is using the discipline of design to do service design in a more imaginative way. But I think what you're describing is the dark side of private involvement in social care, because it's one thing to say, well, the government is inefficient, bureaucratic, we can do it cheaper. Well, okay, maybe, but actually then you repatriate profits, you reduce costs, you use lower skilled labour, etc., etc. It's not a great way to compete, and it does take money out of the system, whereas you could probably keep the money in the system and just use it better. So I think the experience in the UK of outsourcing healthcare in particular has been pretty bad. There's nothing wrong with private healthcare. People are able to pay and they get a great service. That's good, because that is less of a burden on the state, etc. But the idea that you have state-provided healthcare where you outsource chunks of it, what that leads to in the UK is, dirty hospitals, people getting diseases in the hospitals because the cleaning is so poor. What it leads to is, people that don't care about patients, and it's all just a job, etc., etc. So it's had some very negative outcomes, and certainly I would never argue private sector good, public sector bad in terms of these things. I think what matters in every context, whether it's private or public, is people who care. Yeah? If people care, then then you usually get good outcomes. If people don't care, either because you're nothing to their big company or you're nothing to their big bureaucracy, the outcomes are often poor.
So in a way, the really big question is how do you design such, organizations or whatever you call it, where people actually are allowed to care.
Absolutely.
Because that's what the question is also about, that most of us would actually like to care, but more or less pressed by the systems of seeming efficiency to go to situations where actually there is, no opportunity to care.
The goal, in healthcare in the UK, the goal of any individual practitioner when they sit with you is to refer you to someone else. That's their goal, really. And what me and my wife do sometimes is actually go to other countries for healthcare, where you have slightly more old-fashioned doctors who look at you and talk to you, So I won't even begin to go through the stories of horror that we've had with the health service in the UK for that reason. But they don't pay attention to you as a human because it's not a human-centered system; it's a bureaucratic system, and that's the fundamental problem. So in all these, one thing that all of these issues have in common is how do you design networks and incentives, for people to be themselves and to care and to do things that they believe in. And designing incentives is really one of the biggest challenges in all of these organisations, because you do have people that care, you do have people that go into that job because they really want to care for people.
Yeah, and in the beginning, many really do and try.
Yeah.
But little by little, it may sort of dry out.
That's right. Or it's kind of they're told not to, because they're told. Again, it's this fallacy that an impersonal system view of how things work is objective. That's the right thing to do. It's reliable. It's objective, and we know that that's not true.
Yes, please.
I'd like to say that I really enjoy your presentation, specifically because you so insightfully highlighted some of the major trends happening in our society, and I guess also because I personally feel that I fall into many of the these categories. I think maybe I could describe myself as this portfolio worker. On my free time, I'm running this little volunteer group trying to make a website to coordinate with social media development assistance. So I find that personally a lot of my choices are reflected in the greater trends that you highlighted. However, I've just recently returned. I was working in Africa before, recently returned to Finland. I was sort of looking forward to coming back to sort of existing infrastructure that would be somehow supportive to this kind of new way of living and working. However, I found it's quite a struggle actually to sort of find networks and continue working in a meaningful way here, because there's really all the existing infrastructure is aimed for sort of old way of working.
Yeah.
And especially in a country like Finland, where the institutions are really strong, it's sort of very hard to change things, and you sort of have to change so many things to create make a change here. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on what societies have been able to create sort of a more fertile environment for what we envisage the future to be like. What are the, maybe not interventions, but what are the enabling activities that they can do? Because you already commented that a lot of the interventions are actually, they are not helping, but on the contrary, that's my experience too. But so what is sort of, what is your favorite society or city in terms of this kind of?
It's hard to say, and I think it's about ecosystems. It's not really about states. There are very few examples of the state in any place getting that really right, but they can maybe in the background intervene very gently and support certain things. So, the classic examples are obvious. Silicon Valley, for example, has such an incredibly developed ecosystem that it's not to say it's fantastic and it's the future for everybody, etc., etc. But one of the things I really like is that There are so many people in Silicon Valley who've made a load of money, but it doesn't change their life. It doesn't change the way they live, and actually they put that money straight back into either charity or social enterprise, or investing in young people. And so it's an ecosystem that really is self-sustaining in that sense. They're not like British financiers. They don't just want to go off on a yacht and drink out of crystal cups or glasses or whatever. They really genuinely love what they do. That's the key. And so they continually support people. The guy who founded LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman, is amazing. The guy's super rich and yet works 12 hours a day, helping people, meeting people, supporting young companies, all that kind of stuff. And that's a really successful ecosystem. There are others. I think Berlin has got a very interesting feel and ecosystem developing right now. Again, not so much state-backed. There was obviously some incentives for people to locate in Berlin, when it became the capital again. But Berlin is cool. It's got great coffee shops. It's got wonderful young people, and it's cheap. And those are the conditions for a startup kind of ecosystem. Plus it's very tech focused. So that's got kind of an interesting ecosystem as well. I don't really know many other examples, but it's about the ecosystem. That's the key. It's not about just funding or there are some other issues like access to broadband, but that's not such an issue for you guys here. It's like the first world that I love coming in. Tax rules, investment rules. At the moment, everything is geared to you either a company or you're an employee of a company. And if you're not either of those two archetypes, it's actually pretty hard. So contractors in the UK, they've got quite difficult tax rules. They need accountants. It's not easy just to operate like that. So I think there are some underlying things that governments can do to make that sort of stuff easier and to stimulate ecosystems. But at the end of the day, it's down to civil society. This should be a property of civil society. This whole discussion should be about the future of civil society, not the future of companies or the future of states. So it's for us to work it out.
So in a way, you just underlined one of the, or in between the lines, you mentioned one of the crucial role of governments, which would be the enabler of people's own energy. So if we are, if we want something from our governments, that would be the thing. Yeah. So look at European Union and European integration. The European Union is a wildly anachronistic, ridiculous structure these days. You would never design it to be like that in a million years. But it was necessary at one time. And also it did create the conditions where I can live as a genuine European, feel completely at home across the continent. So European integration actually is between us. We are doing European integration, but they have created like a little umbrella to allow some of that to happen. But the kind of things that the EU should focus on is like broadband freedom, internet freedom, no restrictions on usage, and things like data roaming charges on mobile networks. These are the things that, to their credit, they have. Nelly Cruz, one of the commissioners, is pretty smart, and she's tried to focus on those sort of enabling issues, rather than try and intervene more directly. So yeah, the role as an enabler is a key one.
May I briefly suggest an ecosystem here in Helsinki? There's the network of hubs.
Yeah, I know that.
Yeah, okay. Sure. But this network of hubs, they have, those of who you don't know, they attract people who work in various disciplines, and they work in between employment and unemployment, usually freelancers or micro entrepreneurs. That's a space, basically. It depends.
Riina, I think that at this point it would be fair to those who have been sending in some questions or comments, if you summarize or pick up some.
Sure. Thanks for everyone for participating on the in the online feedback, and I think we have many comments under the different discussions here, and we will keep them. And I think some of the questions that we've been just discussing here have been very similar to the ones that we had in the live feedback, and I think it all comes around and revolves around some of these same issues, which relate on the one hand to the issue of incentives, which you just mentioned in terms of looking at the crowdsourcing mechanisms, etc. How do you bring people in more systemically? How do you make sure that if it's a longer-term operational model, how do people get compensated for the work that they do, and how does that become a successful
the other hand, the issue of accountability. So you have these initiatives, and but since the sort of original structures are lacking to a sense, how do you ensure that you have the accountability mechanisms in place, and when do they come into play?
That's actually a very good question, and I think that's one where, again, you know, social networks have something to say on that as well, because the ultimate accountability is transparency and openness and the ability of others to act on that. So if you're doing something which is relatively open and transparent and it's bad, then people need to be able to see that, speak about that, and stop that. The accountability model of, you know, expert from above verifying it, you know, that's still present in certain domains, but it's less and less dominant compared to kind of open feedback model.
And on the other hand, how does that link to the more traditional organizations? And how do you construct the interface where you can bring that type of activity in together with the larger state-led or otherwise more traditional mechanisms? So I think it comes back to some of the questions that we've raised, but I think it exemplifies how important they are and how important it is that we get them right.
Another thing that I felt when listening to you is probably what has been also in my mind previously, but it very strongly came now, is this question of us, you know, as societies, sort of standing in the midst of perhaps we already are in some sort of a new paradigm, and I've just, you know, tried to find a name for what it is. It's not like a welfare state, it's not like, you know, a market economy, or it's not sort of anything that is of the old, and there in particular I would kind of, you know, like to get rid of this growth idea, which as we understand it now, I think is kind of deteriorating not only for the environment but also for our kind of, you know, creative thinking about good lives and how we do our work and so on. So in a way, you know, I was wondering whether you have ever thought of this question of a new paradigm, new era, but new era of what? How should we call it?
I think one of the problems is we're all still locked in the language of classical economics. Yeah, so we measure things in terms of GDP. You know, it's kind of an abstract concept. We talk about the need for growth. You know, the whole financial system is predicated on constant growth. Without constant growth, you know, things go bad. So we have lack of language, and the language is not some kind of hippie, no growth, happiness, you know, alfalfa seeds language either. It's, you know, it's more kind of somewhere in the middle between those things. But it's really hard because, you know, we never intended to set up a company. You know, we started our first company in 1996, and previously we'd worked in politics and different things, and we just wanted to do stuff, but we didn't want to just do stuff and beg for money from George Soros or you know, Roundtree Foundation or whatever. So we did some research and worked out where does money come from, and apparently it comes from companies making money and stuff, so we set up a company. And it was just an archetype that existed that gave you autonomy and the ability to, you know, to do things. And, you know, and that's because the charity sector, the social enterprise sector was just so dull, so unbearably dull in those days. It was just full of people who didn't really work that hard, who just kind of sat there thinking they were wonderful because they weren't working in a company. So we're really struggling for language. You know, we need to think about outcomes. You know, in whatever we do, what are your desired outcomes? And, you know, even in business terms, you know, you can pursue growth, but actually what matters more is profit. And the easiest way to get profit is not just through constant growth, it's actually by managing costs as well. So, you know, in everything we do, if we reduce their costs, and you can think of that in terms of money, you can think of that in terms of environmental impact, in terms of social impact, you know, then you can have a lower growth or even zero growth model that is still improving your situation because you're becoming better at doing it, and you know, you achieve your outcomes better. But yeah, you know, we struggle for that language, you know, with the role of companies as growth. And you know, so many companies that exist in my sector, they pursue, you know, even ones that are super successful, gone to IPO, they're making losses. They're making huge losses. But they are owning a market or owning a territory in the way that investors are happy with, because eventually they can dominate. And again, it's also kind of part of the problem, I think. I think the notion of sustainability has kind of belonged to, kind of the liberals and the international development set, etc., etc. But the notion of sustainability is actually really, really important. And it's important in business as much as it is in society. So we need to find the language of all this stuff.
There is at least one more question, and we have a few minutes, so please do.
Okay. So, not so much as a question, but as a comment. I think we cannot continue like this anyway. The national resources of the globe doesn't allow us to grow. So eventually, what is going to happen? We have to start paying the real cost. I've been an entrepreneur for more than 30 years, and already in the beginning I was thinking, how come this umbrella from China can be below $1? We cannot buy even the fabric in Finland for $1, and they manufacture an umbrella with automatic system. So there is something crucially wrong in this, and the whole economical welfare that we have in Western countries is based on this. We buy at the wrong prices. We pay too little of those things. So I think we have to start thinking that we have to decrease our standard of living, be happy with less, buy good items, and pay the price. And even thinking about this social network and all this kind of entrepreneurship, that is certainly going to rise and increase, but we can't eat Angry Birds, we can't eat iPods, well, anything.
We can, thanks.
There are still things that we need. We need the clothes, we need the housing, we need the food. And this is, we need people to do this. Other people are not even willing to become entrepreneurs, or they are happy to do normal things and routines. Go back home at 4 o'clock and forget it and do the family work. But we have to pay them the decent price of this.
Yeah, I think the things, I agree with a lot of what you said, and I think the things that resonate there for me are, one, I don't think it's about we need to reduce our quality of life. I think we can actually have a good quality of life, but it can cost less, both financially and in terms of environmental damage. If I look at my life, there's a bunch of things that I don't really need. They don't actually improve my quality of life. They're just habits, or things that I've seen on TV, etc. So I think you can still have a very good quality of life, but with a lower financial and kind of environmental cost attached to that. And that's part of the innovation that
life was very good in the 50s.
Yeah, I wasn't there. It sounds great. That's on that fashion, for sure. Yeah, but the other thing is this idea of paying people's time. I think we probably need to get away from this kind of pact with the devil that existed around traditional employment, which is, you give me all the productive years of your life, probably have a divorce, the children that maybe are not close to you in the way that they should be, and I will give you money in return for 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. or 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. or whatever it is. This idea that you're basically paying people's time rather than paying them for value. I think value-based compensation and value-based pricing is something that we're going to see occurring in lots and lots of other sectors. I just don't think it's a good deal to say to somebody, give me the best years of your life, go home and drink too much vodka in the evenings because you hate your boss, and in return you'll get just enough money to have a family, but not much more. I think that's fading away in a sense, and I think that's a good thing, because I don't think that's a great system. So I think that will change. I think the basic employment thing will not become the default mechanism for everybody. It will become more of a minority But you're quite right, you know. A lot of the life that we have is predicated on cheap raw materials or cheap labour or cheap inputs from other countries, etc. And when you start to pay the real costs, then you have to make choices, you know. And I think the choices are about what does it really mean to have good quality of life, you know. Is it that I want to be able to fly to Italy for £20 whenever I want, you know? Or is it actually more fundamental things about family, home, shelter, food, you know, these sorts of issues?
Okay, I think it's time to say thank you, and I hope that, you know, sooner than later, also ecologically speaking, we will have these new paradigms with us through the kind of a attractive route, which is having better lives. But at the same time, I must say that I think that they will also come through the heightening prices and through the ecological catastrophes that we are, you know, gonna face at some point. So in a way, I think there are the, you know, the pushing and the pulling factors in changing our lives. But I think it's also a question of time, of how soon do we get there. But thanks to your active participation, and thanks to Lee for coming and talking to us. Thanks.